Some other things before I go on to the testimony, and since we're on the subject, while doing some reading after I thought I'd finally finished this damn thing, I came across an article that recently talked to Penny Bernstein, and apparently she said that before the Teresa Halbach thing, Steven Avery called her and ho-hummed about this call, and Penny finally came out with it and said, "Steve, are you asking me to buy you a house?" Steven Avery says, "Yes." And Penny says, "That's not possible. We probably should not be talking to each other. I will be deposed in your civil suit," implying that it was already underway. Penny continues, "He was cordial. He wasn't abusive or anything. It was just clear he wanted money from me." Okay. Are there phone records of this call? Why would somebody about to get $36 million be asking someone like her for a house? Doesn't make sense. I could see if he asked her before the suit and realizing he wasn't going to get any money and he was kind of screwed and poor, then filing the lawsuit to get the money, but not that. Not to say that it couldn't or didn't happen, but again, is there evidence to the contrary? Why would she wait 10 years to finally tell this? Her reason for not telling the documentary team? Well, they were convinced that he was innocent and I was not convinced. Okay, does that change the fact of whether or not to tell them that he called you and that you talked about that? Even so, tell them that you think he's guilty, especially if you think he's guilty, and they can choose whether or not to put it in their documentary. Also, I read online that a media analyst said that Steven Avery was not about getting back at law enforcement like he said he was, but was in fact only after money. And not only that, he used this somehow as proof that Avery is guilty. What? Wrong. In fact, this is more proof to the contrary. If Steven Avery was supposedly pressing Penny Bernstein for money before this lawsuit's deposition began and wasn't going to get any money from her, even though this lawsuit was obviously already in full swing according to her, wouldn't that prove further that even though this goes to the argument that this media person was making, that it really was about the money and not about the people involved? Wouldn't that put Steven Avery in a money-grubbing, greedy, miserly-looking position? You're probably nodding your head. You agree with me, and then by extension, the media dude. Okay, say that's the case. If Steven Avery was all about the money, then why on earth would Steven Avery then jeopardize his almost certain chances of getting that massive lottery payout just so he can fulfill his lustful, murderous urge on the brink of collecting big? Bam. Sorry, media dude, but if little old me can take your argument for Steven Avery's guilt, even though it has nothing to do with actual evidence, and easily do an about-face with it and shatter your claim, perhaps I really should go back to law school, a school other than the one you attended. They also make mention of the fact that the Wisconsin AG, or the Attorney General at the time, Peg Lautenschlager, didn't find any wrongdoing with the police's actions in this case. He makes the argument that at the time she was concerned with the issues of restorative and social justice. For those of you in Wisconsin, remember this case came off the heels of the huge Milwaukee pension scandal that basically thrust a previously unknown man by the name of Scott Walker into the Milwaukee County executive seat, and now the seat of the governor of the state of Wisconsin, to which he was also a candidate for president of the United States of America. So these little incidents can cause major waves and have serious effect in the daily lives of all citizens and history. So the effect of taking down a corrupt government official is something that needs to be taken very seriously, which is why, if left unchecked, it can create a very terrible scenario for the citizens of the area involved. As for the pursuit of justice, first off, like Peg Lautenschlager would be the first politician to say one thing and do another. She was also a Democrat Attorney General serving a Democrat Governor, Jim Doyle, also a former Wisconsin Attorney General who happened to be Peg Lautenschlager's predecessor as Attorney General. Democrats get a large portion of their support from unions, specifically public sector unions, which also include police unions. Even the current Wisconsin Attorney General on the opposite side of the political aisle has neglected to proceed with certain policies at the request of law enforcement agencies. Law enforcement agencies are very powerful and have a lot of political clout. That's not uncommon, nor is it necessarily a bad thing. As recent events have shown, police are under a great deal of scrutiny and need to be protected just like any other group, especially since they risk their lives to protect the public. However, this is a double-edged sword. This can also be a bad thing since the clout can also be used to sweep things under the rug, intentionally or not. If what I present here is indeed true, and there is a conspiracy to cover up wrongdoings by numerous individuals and agencies, then what's to say that it didn't go all the way to the top? Sure, that may be far-fetched, but remember the judge in Georgia. There's only about 3 or 4 steps to the top from that position. Now, I have the utmost respect for law enforcement, for the risk they take and the service that they provide. For that, they have great power and great responsibility. For that same reason, I have the utmost lack of respect for those who abuse that power and trust at the expense of those they are sworn to protect. Just like that last scene from the movie A Few Good Men, the Marines are sentenced, and one says that they did nothing wrong because they were simply following orders. And Lance Corporal Dawson says, yes, we did. We were supposed to fight for the people who couldn't fight for themselves. We were supposed to fight for Willie, the Marine who died. In which case, if people in uniform betray that trust, then there is no worse betrayal, and it should be punished accordingly and not covered up because of unwritten alliances. To say with all this evidence that no wrongdoing was found implies lack of information, naivete, or malice. I'm putting the testimony part after the evidence part because all of my evidence observation theories have been based upon what the evidence says and not what human memory says. That, and as I write this, I have yet to look at the interviews. I looked at the evidence and explored what it said and how human nature might play a part in it. What it means, how it got there, and all the possibilities therein. There's a saying that says, people lie, forensics do not. I didn't want my observations to be swayed by what someone said. If what someone says contradicts what the evidence shows, then it means they're either lying or that there are pieces of the puzzle that have not yet come out. I tried my best to explore all necessary situations and tried to objectively conclude what happened. And that is, thus far, Steven Avery is likely not the perpetrator of this crime like the prosecution says. Now, on to the testimony. Given where the evidence seems to point, my theories will be based more on possibilities on what alternatively could have happened, given the evidence direction and human nature, and what the testimony is telling me. It could just be as logical and rote as the prosecution says. Don't know, but my mind thinks differently than most people, so I'll do my best to interpret this. And now, the testimony. Before I delve into this post-viewing note, that I will watch the Brendan Dassey police interviews and or read the transcript, but I am going to do this interpretation as I go along. But before doing so, I read the transcript of the first 2 videos, seeing as how Brendan Dassey seems so quick to respond to things. I read it because even though my reading speed is far from champ level, I can still read faster than he talks. I tried like hell to find something in this interview that was plausible or that was even corroborated by evidence that wasn't public knowledge or mentioned first by the investigators. The reason I came back to this paragraph to write this is that knowing the end result, I am making a prediction before I watch the March 1st interview because I think that there is a serious possibility that Brendan Dassey was set up. But everything I've noted in this testimony segment is stuff that the detective said or referred to. Keep in mind, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever to corroborate anything he is telling, at least as far as the first 2 interviews. If there was one shred of evidence to the contrary, I'd maybe consider it. But he told the story of how he came home, played video games, and then went to Steven Avery's house for a fire, then went to bed. A fire that was supposedly started because there was supposed to be a couple of people coming over, but they canceled. It's what he first says to the detectives, it's what he first writes down when his first attorney's investigator tells him to write down the truth of what happened, but then changes it because, as was said by investigator O'Kelly, otherwise he wouldn't be able to help him. He is also asked to write down a statement about that night in the first interview, which is exactly what he writes down first with investigator O'Kelly, but this time he adds items that the detectives brought up, which are the toes, the part that Steven Avery told him not to say anything, that he stabbed her in the stomach in the pit, and then took the knife and put it under the seat of her Jeep. Again, without the murder stuff at the end that the detectives had mentioned beforehand, it's exactly what he writes down for Kaczynski's investigator O'Kelly, which matches what he told him in the first place. Those are the only points that remain consistent throughout, and they are the only points that were said before any of those things were mentioned first by the detectives, and the only things that were corroborated by physical evidence, or shall I say, uncorroborated by a lack of physical evidence. Those are the reasons that I have trouble believing that this murder testimony is for reals, yo, aside from that aforementioned lack of evidence thing, of course. Also, keep in mind that this whole chain of events began to unfold less than 72 hours after Jody, Steven Avery's fiancée, put forth a written request not to have to speak to the detectives anymore, and ended less than 72 hours after they started to interview Brendan Dassey. An interesting move for a prisoner, considering prisoners love not doing something other than that which gets them out of their cell that they spend most of their day in. Kind of speaks to Steven Avery's innocence to me, yet now Jody thinks that he's a guilty monster? Also, I'll interject that this is a huge rebuttal to what I see as a major turning point in this case. Is this true? Does his ex-fiancée Jody really think he's a monster? Well, let's analyze this new development before we go on. Just the other day, Jody, his ex-fiancée, had an interview with a TV station. She stated that people need to know the truth, that Steven Avery is a monster. Jody, I'd buy that. I'd really try to buy that. And remember, the whole reason I started this endeavor was to find something that proves beyond a reasonable doubt that Steven Avery is guilty. And you claiming this does not qualify for anything other than what goes to character. But as for your statement, I'd buy that if, 1, you didn't call him from prison. And I know prison's a lonely place where you sit around all day doing nothing but even what Steven Avery calls listening to the bars, which is why I find it so odd that you would put the kibosh on the investigators questioning you, but you still called him from prison, the one place where you were safe from him. Then, when you were released, not only did you go back there, you had his own mother pick you up. 2, you say you ate 2 boxes of rat poison to get away from him, which would not only have killed you, but would have certainly got you away from him, especially if the cops were looking for anything to pin on this guy. However, hospitals won't release you if they think for a second that you tried to commit suicide. They will keep you there for counseling on a locked floor where you can't get out no matter how much you want to without a psychologist or a psychiatrist approval. So this claim doesn't really hold up, Jody. 3, you could have used him being in jail as the excuse to flee, yet you didn't do so even after the cops nailed you for seeing him across the street. Yet you kept taking his phone calls and tried to keep in contact with him even after you got a job and left his house. 4, why didn't the cops or prosecution bring that up? Ever? Would you not have told them that? Like perhaps during an interview in prison? And since we're talking about the cops, I'm going to include this here and not a separate number. You said that you had to call the cops on him numerous times. One time he beat you to a pulp and then dragged you out to the car so that you guys wouldn't be there when the cops got there. But they pulled you over anyway, and you were so badly beaten that they told him not to be by you for 3 days? Boy, that sounds like a real hearty ass whooping. Do you have any pictures of this? Does anyone have any pictures of this? Do the cops have pictures of this? And don't think I take that sort of thing lightly. If I had my druthers, I'd put every single one of these guys in the electric chair and pull the lever myself. Again, if you were beaten that badly, somebody would have documented something, somewhere, somehow, and done something more than just suggest that you guys stay away from each other for 3 days. And I'm not saying you're lying, but if you are, it demeans the real victims. So if you could provide photo proof or even police written report proof that any of this happened on any of these supposed numerous occasions, I'll believe you. By the way, I ask this as somebody who's familiar with alcoholism and drug addiction. Were you drunk during any of these instances? 5, why didn't you then go far, far away when you were released? Remember, he was locked up, so not only could you have petitioned the state or a battered woman's group to relocate you to a safe place even if he was out free, you had no worries because he was in the slammer when you got out. So why not move? 6, why didn't you tell anyone this until well after the buzz hit presidential pardon levels? 7, why did you not interview with the documentary team that one last time? You would at least have it on record then to back up your story now, and you would be the one monkey wrench in their attempt to canonize Steven Avery, yet you declined. You were already part of the film, so it's not like you were in a position to say, well, I don't want to be any part of it. And I find it funny how both you and Penny Bernstein had the same I need to come forward moment within a week of each other after the release of this film, when you had a decade to do just that. Especially when you were the only 2 people who could have possibly derailed the filmmaker's whole train, or at least nudge it from the tracks. And last but not least, number 8. Why the hell didn't you bury Steven Avery while you were in jail and put this monster away forever, instead of telling the very cops who were trying to do just that to buzz off by signing a written request not to see them anymore? I'm sure I'll eventually have more points other than that which I just wrote right off the bat after hearing about this, but Jody, if you can answer those questions, I might believe you. But the most amazing part of that interview is something that I don't think anyone's caught yet. It was an aha moment that really made me open my eyes. She said she had to go through 4 months of intense therapy because of the guilt she felt because she was not there with Steven Avery when Teresa Halbach was killed. If she would have been there, then according to her, Teresa Halbach would still be alive. You might be thinking, well, how would that even have been possible? She was in jail. Well, apparently, and I didn't know this, I'm familiar with Huber. Huber is where you spend time in jail, usually at night, but then you get to go out during the week, during the day, in order to work, or say if you have a funeral to attend or a wedding to attend, they'll let you out for that. And it's usually if somebody's doing time for drunk driving or some lesser crime, they'll let you out and be a productive member of society, which makes sense. Well, apparently, even though Jody, of course, couldn't stand Steven Avery and how abusive he was, she was apparently going to be let out of jail that night for a few hours in order to attend a meeting with Steve. The meeting had something to do with her treatment for her alcohol dependency. Apparently, this is something common, or at least it was with her, because this was pretty much a routine event that he would pick her up and they would go to this. Well, the day that Teresa Halbach disappeared, they were supposed to let her out for the meeting. Lo and behold, she wasn't let out. And to this day, she doesn't have an explanation as to why they did that or who called that shot. And she's feeling guilty about this. She thought that if she was only there that night with Steven Avery, this wouldn't have happened. That's why she feels so guilty. Well, has anyone ever asked, did this ever happen before? Did they ever not let her out before? If they didn't, maybe it was because of a behavioral problem or some sort of timing conflict or a guard wasn't there. But to this day, she has no answer as to why they didn't let her out the exact day that Teresa Halbach went missing. Now, I don't know, maybe my brain thinks differently than most people's, but that is a huge red flag. You've got this whole conspiracy theory about the cops being involved in Teresa Halbach's murder, and the one night that Steven Avery's fiancée Jody is supposed to get let out in order for them to go to a meeting, bam, sorry, you can't go. No explanation, nothing. Why would that happen? Well, let's see. If somebody gets let out of prison, there's paperwork. There's a timestamp. When somebody comes back to prison, there's paperwork. There's a timestamp. How is somebody supposed to be murdering somebody when they're at a meeting with other people, with witnesses, and timestamps to corroborate their whereabouts? Even though this interview was basically supposed to put the light back on Steven Avery and what a creep he was, even though, as I explained earlier, that she could have done all this beforehand, she gives the one piece of evidence that even further clinches this theory that the police were involved. Who didn't let her out? Who called that shot? You go there, you're going to start rattling some cages. And that could be the one key piece of evidence that's brand new that cracks this case wide open and shows who might have done this. Before we move on, I'd also like to mention something that Shawn Atwood was saying on one of his video posts talking about juror number 11. Juror number 11 was the one that was in the film. He was one of the 7 jurors that thought Steven Avery was innocent, or at least not guilty. He also talked about how 3 of the jurors who thought he was guilty were the ones that pretty much took over the conversation. Juror number 11 was also the one that was excused for medical reasons. They never really went into it, but it said medical reasons. Well, apparently the reason was because his daughter got into a car accident. However, the car accident happened under pretty suspicious circumstances. Apparently a car in front of him slammed on the brakes to make a left turn, which they signaled, but signaled very late, almost as if to cause the accident. These are their words, not mine. And it was suspicious because it's in the middle of nowhere, yet the cops were there in less than 2 minutes. Very, very odd. Again, like most of this case and most of my arguments, this is all circumstantial, but it does follow a pattern. But to continue with what I was talking about before, let's go back to the only 2 options here that the cops are either trying to mold his testimony or they have Scrabble blindness. There is a third option to which they're idiots, but I'm trying not to go there, both out of respect for law enforcement and the ostrich head in the sand hope that this isn't evidence of your tax dollars being wasted on morons with the authority to carry guns and to put people behind bars. Remember, your local law enforcement isn't a pro sports team. They don't trade investigators from other areas and states because they grow this reputation and are coveted by departments far, far away. Why would they? Why would you need a top-notch big city homicide investigator to work your small community that maybe has 1 or 2 homicides a year? That wouldn't make much sense. Many law enforcement officers are either from the area they eventually work in, and this case clearly points that out since even the Averys are related to everybody in this case, it seems, or the officers work in areas fairly close to where they grew up. The point I'm making is that since law enforcement agencies generally promote from within, and the bottom pyramid tier is usually made up of local people, you basically have a limited pool for promoting the best candidate. You're usually stuck with the best candidate from the group at hand. Now, I can tell you right now that I would never win a beauty contest, but if the other three contestants are the Three Stooges, then I'm by far the top contender. So in an attempt to give the benefit of the doubt to options 1 and 2, I still understand the reality of how the world works and how option 3 is a legitimate possibility. As for the other two options, Scrabble blindness. Have you ever played Scrabble and you try so desperately to get big point words with Q and X that you miss a bunch of little words in the interim that would have won you the game? Or have you ever played Texas Hold'em and been so focused on that river card giving you the flush that you fail to see that the person raising your bets possibly has a full house? I have. So are the detectives here focused so much on trying to get out of them the story that fits the crime and evidence at hand that they look past the bull that's coming out of this kid's mouth? Or are they trying to sculpt something they want? Given the results, I can tell you which way I think they lean. The Mishicot High School transcript analysis. To start off with, he got her shirt color wrong right off the bat. The detective asked if he saw any body parts. He asked, "Did you see a hand, a foot, something in the fire, her bones? Did you smell something that was not too right?" And that's a quote from the transcript. And this is before Brendan Dassey mentions anything of the sort. The first body part after that Brendan Dassey names is the toes. He said he saw Teresa Halbach's car on the other side of the street. He said he went out around 9 o'clock. He said Steven Avery, while in a Jeep, tied her up and stabbed her. Yet there was nothing to corroborate, no rope fibers, no ligature marks, no blood, no knife. A knife that Steven Avery supposedly hid under the seat of the Jeep. He also keeps saying Jeep, even though he grew up and lives by his family's business, which is an auto salvage yard, and clearly knows the identities of a Suzuki and a Monte Carlo that were near or in the garage. So does he really mean Jeep or Teresa Halbach's SUV, the Toyota RAV4? The detectives were the first to mention the pit. Brendan Dassey says Steven Avery cut his finger in the garage on glass. Steven Avery was arrested on November 9th, 9 days after the supposed murder. What cut stays around for 9 days? Diabetics and hemophiliacs, perhaps. Was Steven Avery diabetic? If so, wouldn't that be worth noting on both sides of the courtroom? People in the auto industry have, quote-unquote, working man's hands. That's something I noticed at the beginning of the film, how big Steven Avery's dad's hands were. They're the hands of somebody who did years of manual labor. If Steven Avery's hands were like that from doing body work in prison and 2 years working in the yard, then they were probably big and calloused as working hands are. Calloused hands do crack, but they don't bleed nearly as much as the hand of somebody who sits at a computer all day. Not to say it can't happen, but it certainly is less likely. Not to say that a cut can't actively bleed for that long either, but then where are the fingerprints? I don't know anybody who eats jelly without some sort of bread, i.e., you don't usually have one without the other. Usually if you have blood, you have fingerprints too. That's more for the evidence part, but it's worth noting. I'll also note that if he stabbed her in the stomach, which is later claimed, to which you would get blood and poop all over you, then unless you're wearing gloves, and even if you're wearing gloves, you'd cut yourself. The thing that does most stabbing assailants in regarding forensic evidence is that unless the knife has substantial quillins, the guard between the handle and the blade, to prevent the hand from moving forward onto the blade, which is almost inevitable when the human body eventually stops the intense forward motion of the knife, but not the hand, to which somebody stabbing the victim trying to kill them would do, the assailant slices the inner flesh of his or her fingers. Couple that with the adrenaline, which in turn causes the assailant not to notice that they've cut themselves, usually doesn't happen just once. So as they stab multiple times, they receive multiple cuts on the inner part of their finger. On the inner part, mind you, where your fingers bend at the joint, not in between the fingers. Most stabbings are a crime of passion, usually anger. So if Steven Avery stabbed Teresa Halbach because he was angry, he would have a great deal of force to thrust the knife into Teresa Halbach, almost certainly cutting his inner fingers. Granted, they keep asking Brendan Dassey why Steven Avery did it. They keep asking if he was angry at something. But even so, if Steven Avery stabbed her for whatever reason, it's not something you do lightly. Brendan Dassey tells them that Steven Avery thought he might crush the car and or start it on fire. The main piece of evidence that ties into this crime, yet He doesn't do the same thing to the car that he did with the body. Burn it or crush it. A car on a salvage yard with a car crusher, no less. My dad got halfway to the airport once before realizing that he forgot his tickets, so I guess not getting rid of murder evidence, especially when you're in the only profession that has the equipment to do so on the premises, is just as likely, right? What a load of crap. Detective Wiegert also asks him about duct tape. Why? No duct tape was found or mentioned at all before or any time during the trial. I can tell you that when you rip off a piece of duct tape, you at least leave your thumbprint on the roll. I remember seeing a forensic crime show where the murderer planted some duct tape near the crime scene in order to try and implicate someone else because the someone else's print was on that tape. They used rubber gloves to plant the duct tape and whammo, instant suspicion. So I'm willing to bet that if he can get Brendan Dassey to say something about the duct tape, then he can use a piece of duct tape with Steven Avery's fingerprints on it to possibly put in a conspicuous place. Again, I don't recall that in the trial, so my guess is that he never gets Brendan Dassey to say anything about it. Then again, I've not listened to the last interview. Speaking of which, why would Steven Avery shackle Teresa Halbach yet not use duct tape to muffle her screams? Is that why the detectives ask about duct tape to which there's no evidence for or fingerprints on? Wouldn't make much sense because if Steven Avery used duct tape over Teresa Halbach's mouth, then Brendan Dassey probably would never have heard the screams, to which he would never have gone near the trailer, to which he probably would not currently be sitting in the slammer. Of course, this is assuming that what the prosecution believes really happened. Given the nature of this case, it seems more believable that the reason he's asking could be construed as such that he is looking for things to be able to plant. Or is he grasping at straws with all this juicy testimony coming out? They ask again about the body being cut up, but then they ask him to put the part about her body being whole in the statement. To which I'll ask again, how could they justify the charge of mutilation of a corpse? How did they get that tacked on? Because the forensic anthropologist looked at severely burnt bones and somehow concluded that Teresa Halbach was cut up? How? Did they ever say what that was? I'd like to know. It was obviously more convincing than the thing that got them the rest of the supposed evidence, Brendan Dassey's testimony, so what was the trump card in that decision? There are more addendums to the statement on page 34 if you care to look. Also, does Detective Wiegert really not know what cursive is? If he doesn't, I feel relieved that he carries a gun and has the power to arrest people. If he does, and he's either taunting this kid or just sort of playing at Brendan's level, shouldn't he then be aware that Brendan Dassey doesn't have the brain power to understand what is taking place? Not to mention that if he's been doing this job for such a long time, shouldn't he really know when somebody's not telling the truth? Does he, with this remark, know what he's doing in bending the statement to fit what they're telling him? It's either that, or this is showing you Option 3, how these are your tax dollars hard at work. Then they ask if Brendan Dassey has told anyone anything, even his mom. He says no. They say they want to know everything so there are no surprises that come out later. They also say that they need to talk to his mom. They say that they will need to contact her so they can talk to her. So the only 3 people, aside from Steven Avery and the now deceased Teresa Halbach, assuming that this scenario is true, the only other people who know any of this are the 2 detectives and Brendan Dassey. Barb Jonda doesn't know anything yet, so they can tell her whatever they want, or if they're trying to sculpt something nefarious, not tell her anything at all. Quite honestly, I can believe that the 2 detectives were sincerely doing a routine questioning, idiotic as it may have been, with no nefarious ulterior motive. However, the problem I have is that you've got 2 seasoned professionals. Remember, they themselves said, we can tell when people are lying. One is a special agent at the state level for the Wisconsin Department of Justice, and neither of them pick up on the fact that no evidence after 4 months of investigation from when this crime occurred even remotely points to what this kid is saying, and nothing he has said so far is anything even resembling story form. If you ask anyone to describe an event, football game, golf game, tennis game, video game, concert, birthday party, stag party, whatever, you're going to get a narrative. Every event has at least one memorable thing happen to which people tell a story, or at least have the contents to tell a story, sometimes to the chagrin of others. Oh great, here goes so-and-so telling another long, boring story again. You'd think that if he saw something that was so devastating that he held it in for 4 months and was losing weight and felt sad about it and was finally getting it off his chest, that he would give more than 1 word or 1 sentence answers to guided questions. They'd say, tell us what happened, and he'd start blabbing. If it weren't for that and the other behavior later on in this case to insinuate police wrongdoing and the lawsuit, I wouldn't question these two detectives. Just yet, anyway. The first